good morning friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that today is the last lecture on the series on history of English literature. So far we have conducted almost 30 sessions, and all the lectures are already uploaded on YouTube for you for your easy accessibility. So dear friends, as I already said that this is the last lecture, and today we will be talking on post-colonialism. And for this very discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya. Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya is formerly Vice Chancellor of Kurukshetra University. He is a renowned academician who is appreciated, admired and loved in India and abroad. He has written numerous books and all his books are also widely appreciated. So let's welcome our guest Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya, and let's try to get in-depth knowledge on the topic post-colonialism. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you. Well, we shall discuss today post-colonialism. As can be seen from the very sound of it, this resembles postmodernism, which we did earlier. And post comes after something, thereafter modernism, hereafter colonialism. Post-colonialism has clear overtones of politics, which postmodernism did not. The postmodernism related to a literary movement called modernism. But post-colonialism relates to colonialism, which was a political phenomenon. During the 18th and 19th centuries, mostly, some of the European countries occupied the weaker nations in Latin America, Middle East, and Asia, largely India. Now, these imperial countries colonized these weaker nations, and hence the process came to be called as colonization. And these countries, including India, we became colonies. So these countries where Congo was one in Africa, India was another, then Brazil, etc., in Latin America, even in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Now, these countries were occupied by the Europeans. The British were the leading imperial power. Netherlands was another, and a few more. We are more concerned about Britain because we in India were colonized by the British, which again happened in the 18th century. And this phenomenon of colonization also affected literature just as it did other aspects of life. So literature could not have remained unaffected by this powerful phenomenon. As Michael Foucault has very aptly said, knowledge and power are closely related. You cannot separate them. And it is power which determines the course of knowledge. So the imperial power, the British in India, would obviously have their own kind of system of education, so that the Indians can be kept subjected to their rule, their dominance, their superiority. So much so that these 200 years were so long that even today, in the unconscious or subconscious mind of most Indians, it is engraved that British are the superior people. And this is precisely what they wanted. And they hammered it in our minds that they are civilizing us by giving us education, by starting schools and colleges, by giving new knowledge of science and technology, and above all, by giving the language and culture embedded in the English language. This was their colonial program. Now, after they left in 1947, by the time they had left most countries, the phenomenon of decolonization actually began right after World War I, 1918, when the war ended. And after that, it continued until the end of World War II in 1945. So most countries by 1950 roughly were liberated from the colonial clutches. India got freedom in 1947. So this phenomenon of colonization and then decolonization, this obviously had its own repercussions on our education, on our culture, on our literature, arts, every aspect of life. It was natural. So the literature produced during that period was heavily influenced by their culture and their ideas of enlightenment, Renaissance, which had started in the 16th century, completed in the 18th. Thereafter, the process of colonization began. So those ideas of enlightenment thrust upon us, and we were made to feel as if a great favor was being done to us, that from a primitive society people, we were being transformed into a civilized nation. And our own civilization, which was thousands of years older, much older than their own, than the European or British civilization, that was suppressed. We were made to believe that was no civilization, that was just primitivism, absence of culture and civilization, and therefore we must now learn what they have to give us. This was colonization. So when we speak of post-colonial literature and post-colonial criticism, which means after the period of colonization was over. Like in India, post-colonial period began after 1947. But things don't happen that precisely and accurately. Actually, the post-colonial text means anti-colonial and emphasizing our local life and culture. This had started right in the time of the British rule itself. And there were writers who had started writing texts which gave a true picture of what India was like and how distortions had come about in our life, in our culture, in our literature, because of the foreign imposition, foreign rule, foreign dominance, foreign restrictions and repressions. So this had started right in their presence. Tagore, for example. Tagore started writing in the 19th century. That's when he was born. Or early 20th, right in their presence. And he wrote nationalist songs, Gitanjali itself. But when he composed them, and gave a song like Jana Gana Mana Adhinayak, he said, supposedly I have written it to welcome George V, the ruler of England and therefore the ruler of the English colonies, including India. He was visiting the Indian colony, and therefore, in his honor to welcome him, Tagore was asked to write a song. He said, all right, I'll do that, but I will not welcome him myself. I'll not read out what I write myself. And he wrote it in a manner that they wouldn't even follow the real spirit of the song. And he said it, you can take it and please yourself. You can read out to them, but you and they will not follow what I really mean. Because they thought he was calling George V as Janaganaman Adhinayak, as if Lord of the people, people of India. Actually, he was addressing God, Janaganaman Adhinayak, not this fellow, but God himself. So we had this post-colonial thrust in Indian literature right when colonialism was there in India, when the British were very much present as rulers under their own eyes. Writers like Tagore did it. And even before that, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. He was actually the first one. He wrote an equally strong nationalist piece right in the face of the British. So these were the people, great writers, who started post-colonial literature right in the colonial period, when the colonizing powers were here occupying us, ruling us. So they were brave people in a way. Writers who had the guts to write nationalist songs. So even Jana Gana Man, and even before that Bankim Chandra, these people had written for their motherland. And in 1882, there was that uprising, revolt of saints, sadhus. They had stood up against the British and opposed some of the things they were imposing upon them. They said, no, we will not deviate from our Indian way of life, and we will stick to our religion and our practices. So they revolted against the British rulers, the imperial power. So there is a long history of politics and literature inspired by politics. So what we call post-colonial literature is actually this literature which was inspired by the politics of anti-colonialism. So very overtly and very strongly, it has political overtones, a political content, not merely component. The very central, the very spirit of this literature is nationalist and anti-imperial. So this is what we call post-colonialism. Sorry. In 1899, Joseph Conrad, one of the English writers, he had written a novel called, which we used to teach and also studied in our English course in MA, Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness. And what place is this? Heart of Darkness? This is Congo in Africa. So we in Asia and Africa were considered the dark nations, means ignorant, undeveloped, uncivilized. So he had the cheek to write this Heart of Darkness. that on this earth, we in Asia and Africa, we constitute the heart of darkness, means ignorance, total ignorance. So such novels were there. Even later, like E.M. Foster's A Passage to India. Strangely, E.M. Foster had a job here. One of our kings or princes in Madhya Pradesh, there E.M. Foster acted as the secretary to the king. They used to keep liaison with the British power and to be guided in the Western ways. So E.M. Foster also did that job over 2 years. And then he wrote this novel called A Passage to India. His experience of living in India, seeing India, and comprehending India, whatever comprehension you could have. I say that because all that he writes about it is not really true about us. But that is how he looked at us, with his limitations of being an Englishman, being the other, living in the fool's paradise of superiority. So obviously, he wouldn't have seen reality as it really was. He saw it through the colored glasses of an Englishman, of a ruler, of a supposedly superior civilization. So that is what A Passage to India is. But then, particularly after the British left, and even before that, as I mentioned, anti-colonial texts or post-colonial texts, there is a difference. Anti-colonial is outrightly opposed to colonialism, and they had the guts to oppose and criticize the colonial rulers. So that is anti-colonial text. But post-colonial is just historically placed after the colonial period is over. So it becomes post-colonial. So the difference, as I said, between the anti-colonial and post-colonial is that anti-colonial is overtly against the colonial powers, the colonial culture, the colonial tradition of literature, and so on. Everything that related to them. But post-colonial is the one that follows when the colony is over, say after 1947. Now what they are doing, particularly in post-colonial criticism, what they are doing is reinterpret the colonial period, which is safer now. The British rulers are no longer there. We are a free nation. We can say what we want to say, and we can look back and reinterpret what our life was like when we were a colony of the British. So that is what post-colonial literature and criticism is. And this has a place of its own, and an important place at that, because in our curriculum of English studies, we now give it ample space in the curriculum. Earlier it had no place, because only the select texts showing their superiority, promoting their own interests, their own values, their own agenda, that was included. So selections were made on that basis. Today selections are made on a different basis. We give preference to all those texts that hold Indian life in proper light, at least if not in high esteem, and is able to show mirror up to nature. As I always quote Hamlet in Shakespeare's play Hamlet, while instructing the players, he says this to the actor because he wants to catch the conscience of the king, his own uncle, who has murdered his father and married his mother and has usurped the crown, becoming himself the king. So, Hamlet wants to confirm that all this story is correct, because then he would like to take revenge for his father's murder. But then he wants to be sure that he does not take a wrong step, does not kill a wrong person. Therefore, to confirm that Claudius, his own uncle, is the real culprit, he organizes this show. Well, we'll take it up later, this show. All right. Well, to resume our story of post colonialism, we must also have a clear notion about what colonialism was really there and what phenomenon actually it was. The basis for colonialism was not so much political as economic, because you want to exploit the resources, the riches, the potentials of weaker nations whom you can grab and exploit. So that is the real motive behind colonization, behind imperialism. The British economists, we call them liberal economists or classical economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, right in the 18th century, they had written books on the subject. Their thesis was that imperialism, colonization, these processes, these phenomena are not so much rooted in politics as in economics. Because you want to exploit the resources of the weaker people or nations, and you want to exploit it to your advantage, making more money, selling their resources or using them for industrial goods, producing more and more through your industries which they don't have. So using their raw material for running your own industries. Adam Smith and David Ricardo, they explained the whole philosophy of colonization, of imperialism. Their own economists minded. And they said it is not just the military or political power which is actually behind these invasions of the weaker nations. The real motive, the crux of the matter is economic. And we know it by experience, how the Indian resources, all our metals, minerals, other natural resources were drained out by the British, only to feed their industries in England. And the end product of those industries that made profits for the British, not for us. We didn't get anything. So we were exploited as a resource, we were exploited as labor. So both ways, our resources and our manpower, they were misused and abused for their own profit motives. That was post colonialism. After they left, we could look back and reinterpret what they were actually doing. At that time, we did not have either the means or the guts to do that scanning, to do that of interpretation. But now we could. We had the means. We had the method. We had the technical know-how, knowledge to do all that. And we did. So it is in this context that writers like Tagore or even Bankim Chandra, they become prominent. And then, of course, there is a host of later writers. Gayatri Spivak, for example, one of the recent ones. Then a subsidiary of it, writing about the subalterns, people who were really exploited, not merely by the British but by our own people. Our own rich people will exploit the poor people. So in this direction, historians like Ramchandra Guha, they have written extensively about the whole phenomenon and practice of exploitation of the subalterns. Subalterns are the poorest of the poor. They are also called in this terminology the fourth estate. There is the first, the imperial, there is the second, the colonized, and then there is the third, the newly liberated. But then even among them remain the fourth estate, the poorest of the poor, the exploited ones. Even today, even in the so-called free nations, they are exploited because they are poor not to defend themselves. Even when they know that they are being exploited, they are not getting the worth for their labor. They can't do a thing because they have to subsist. They have to have some means of subsistence, of continuing life, of feeding their families, children, wives, and so on, dependents. So it is they who are called subalterns. So in post-colonial literature, we have had all this, not merely confined to describing, analyzing, criticizing the imperial powers, their exploitation of our people and of our resources, but also similar kind of exploitation by our own people, by the rich, by the dominant ones, the powerful ones. So all this is covered under the blanket term of post-colonial literature. We find poetry, we find fiction, we find drama. So, in all forms of Indian literature of the period, say after 1950, we have this slant, we have this emphasis, we have this expose of the colonial exploitation or similar kind of exploitation which continued even after decolonization. So, all this comes under post-colonial literature, which has become a sort of genre by itself, which has become a sort of discipline by itself. And courses are formed, framed, structured to give shape to that history. Because the best way to get knowledge about anything is to organize it as history. You can't get that knowledge by making haphazard or ad hoc kind of reading. You have to systematically organize it first in the historical order, chronological. What came first and then what followed. That is chronological order. That is history. And then you have to look sideways, look into other dimensions of this reality. Other dimensions are political, cultural, literary, so on and so forth. So, coming to the last, that is what we are doing. The impact of imperialism on our literature. The impact during the colonial period and the reaction to that period in the post-imperial era. So, that is what we have today. Even texts like Mulk Raj Anand's The Coolie, it depicts that period of the 1930s and shows how the life of the poor was conditioned, constrained, repressed, regressed by the dominant powers that were there. Not merely the imperial ones, but even the local ones, our own people who were privileged. So, the privileged always exploit the poor. It's as simple as that and as old as that. You can go back into history to even the ancient times. And all along, history will bear it out that this has been the standard practice. And not merely in one society or community, in one nation or continent, but all over, colonized or not colonized, free or bonded. All of the countries have had it. And why countries? Societies, communities, even small groups of people, they have had it. Which means finally it points to human nature, that there is something in our nature itself that we want to dominate others and we want to use them to our advantage, which will not rule out exploitation, misuse of your power, of your authority, of your dominance, of your superior abilities. All that you use to your own advantage and to the disadvantage of the other. That's why the concept of the other came up, because othering can mean many things, many levels, many dimensions, aspects. And the psychologists, Freud and then post-Freudian Lacan, they say that othering goes to such a limit that finally everybody except your own self is the other. Therefore, you separate yourself from the rest of mankind, rest of humanity, which in a way shows the selfishness, the self-centeredness of our individual nature and individualism. On the opposite of it is socialism, sharing everything, including our miseries, our poverty, our destitution, and learn to bear it together, live it together. But more natural to mankind, which has been the experience and history bears it out, has been individualism, self-centeredness, protecting your own personal interests, and working for enriching your own personal resources, strengthening your own base and forte. So this has been there in history. And all this comes out in our writings. This may be pertaining to the colonial period or the one following it, the post-colonial, which means literature is not merely history. There is a difference. and we must not forget that difference. The history is strictly bound by time and place, by the local and immediate conditions, whereas literature is not. It may have that circle of existence also. It would have. After all, it relates to reality, it reflects reality. But at the same time, the writer who does it, the creative artist, is the man or woman of imagination who look beyond reality and try to reconstruct that reality into your own dreams and aspirations. How to make this life better, more worth living, more palatable, comfortable to yourself and to the rest of mankind. So all that comes in the writing. Therefore, the man of letters, the writer, does not confine himself to history. So that is the vital difference between history and literature. And that's why literature is called universal, because history will be applicable only to the life bound by space and time, to particular space and time. If it is history of India, history of the Mughals, history of the Rajputs or whatever, or of the British, it will pertain to that particular period. So you have to go by the calendar, and it will reflect only that life. But literature, even when it begins with the reflection of that particular life, it will not stop there. It has to give larger dimension to that life. It has to look into the elements which are common to other people also, and which have been common all along the history of mankind, not merely today, not merely yesterday, but always. So it is this universal element, universal aspect, dimension of literature, the narration, the depiction, the reflection of life, which sets it apart from history and other narratives. Because historical and other narratives are limited. They are bound by time and space. They do not have larger relevance. They don't apply to anything outside of that reality. You may say similar, because after all, in history, there are parallel situations, similar ones, but that's about all. Whereas in the literary narrative, every story, every drama or poetry, it has to attain that level of universality. Otherwise, it doesn't become literature. It remains history. It remains of local interest. So even when it begins as a local narrative, and it always does, after all, there are numerous languages that we have, and we have numerous communities, various universe as it is. Even within India, we have 28 official languages and several thousand dialects which are spoken by different groups of people. And each of that individual group has its own narratives with their own peculiar features. So obviously, they will have their own histories. Thus, post-colonial literatures, I say literatures because it is not singular, it's a variety and different phases, different dimensions. It began right when the colonial period was here. So post-colonialism had cropped up right at the time and in the very face of it, face of colonialism. Later on, of course, when we were decolonized, then we had more bold narratives because we could more freely, frankly, and with guts say things which were not possible to be said when the rulers, foreign rulers, were here. So this is what we have post-colonial literature. It has a link with the colony because we look back. That is the difference between the other literature which has no sign of any colonization. So post-colonial is a literature which looks back, which relates to a history which is no longer there. But at the same time, it looks forward, it reflects upon, it analyzes that literature in the historical context as well as in the larger context. So we call it post-colonial. I think enough for the day. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very precious session. And dear friends, as I have already said that this was the last lecture, and we believe that if you have any feedbacks or any kind of questions which you like to be answered, you can mail us at cc@nic.in. All the lectures concerning to the series History of English Literature are there for you on the YouTube. This lecture is also going to be uploaded, and we would like to tell you all that as this was the last lecture, but if you feel so that you want to have a session on any of the topics which were not included, though we have tried to sum up the entire series, still you can write to us at info.cc@nic.in. Very soon we are going to start a very new series with the Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya, and we believe that the series would also be going to be very, very beneficial for you. So we would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.